hello and happy Friday. And I'm sorry again for starting a little late. Technical issues as always. But as Casey mentioned, my name is MJ Altman, Molly Jean Altman. Molly, you can call me whatever you like. I am a senior communications officer at the United Nations Foundation. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that supports the mission of the UN. I see some nodding. I like that. I want to, don't go away. I want to thank you guys so much for welcoming me to the University YMCA. It really is an honor to be here and kind of surreal to be back on campus after a long time away. I grew up not far from here in the middle of cornfields, so my heart will always belong to Central Illinois. And as proof of that, I thought I'd show you guys a little satellite image of my hometown called Lexington, literally right in the middle of the cornfields about 50 miles from here. As Casey mentioned, I'm a 2006 graduate of the University of Illinois, and coming from such a small and really homogeneous town like Lexington, I will say that when I first came to campus as a freshman, it was here that I got to meet people from all different backgrounds and religions and ethnicities and beliefs for the first time really in my entire life. And it was incredibly eye-opening and exhilarating and kind of scary, just because, again, it was very different from where I grew up. And this incredible diversity right here in the middle of Central Illinois is, I think, one of the many reasons why the University of Illinois is so special. The University Y is also special for me because, as Casey mentioned, I joined the Students for Environmental Concerns when I was here. It's where I really learned about the power of civic action, thanks in large part to Casey. I launched the Green Observer my senior year, and I have some people here who are current students and still keeping that publication going 12 years later. So that's really just incredible. And Casey and I have actually known each other since we were freshmen living in LAR, and so as proof, I thought I'd show you guys this photo. This is Casey and I at 18. I'm standing on top of what we called the haunted toilet because it would flush on its own at random times during the night. And I also just wanted to embarrass her a little bit. So before I get to the UN and its impact, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my background. I've had a very interesting career so far, and one that you might describe as pretty non-linear. I studied sociology and journalism here, and I wrote for the Daily Illini. As Casey mentioned, I covered everything from engineering news to local politics. In 2004, I wrote about a then little-known state senator named Barack Obama, and as the kicker of the article I wrote, I quoted someone saying, "He's going to be our next president." And we laughed about that in the newsroom because we thought that was insane, lo and behold. My senior year, I interned at MSNBC in New York, and I decided to move there after graduation and work as a page at NBC. Does anybody know what that is? Has anyone seen 30 Rock? Okay, that was me, literally. Like unbridled enthusiasm and dorky uniform and all. From there, I went to work for Time Magazine as a web producer and a writer-reporter. And again, I got to cover a lot of different things: environmental issues, the 2008 presidential election with our Illinois candidate. And working at Time really opened my eyes to the importance of a wide variety of perspectives. One of my favorite assignments involved a special anniversary package on the Iraq War. And we examined the conflict through the lens of a lot of different individuals, through the lens of a US soldier, an Iraqi worker, a US senator, and a local Iraqi journalist. And I had the opportunity to interview all of these people and share their really unique perspectives and insights with millions of readers. And it was a really incredibly powerful experience for me to be able to do that. I also saw the real-life impact of storytelling, not just for the readers who were picking up Time Magazine or going to time.com, but also for the people I was interviewing. I was writing a story about student loans, which is something, unfortunately, I'm sure many of you guys, students out there, know too much about. And I interviewed a woman who was facing bankruptcy over her daughter's student loans. Even though her daughter had never completed her degree, she had been killed in a car accident. After the article was published, this woman called me back. And she said, after 2 years of unsuccessful calls to her loan company, she had finally received word that the debt, about $40,000, that was going to sink her into bankruptcy, had been forgiven. And it was because of the story that ran in Time magazine. For me, that was a moment when I realized that I wanted to go from journalism to advocacy, because I wanted to be able to be an advocate for people who couldn't speak truth to power. So I moved to DC, and I started working at the Smithsonian, at their Native American Museum, which at the time was the newest museum on the Mall and really kind of turned the idea of museums on its head. It was a museum created by the Native American tribes of the Western Hemisphere for the Native American tribes of the Western Hemisphere, really almost more of a living cultural center. And in that role, I had the opportunity to interview tribal elders from all over the country and learn about current social justice issues that were affecting indigenous communities that, to be honest, I had no idea about before I started at the Smithsonian. And these issues ranged from poverty and discrimination to teen suicide rates and racist Native American sports mascots. And this experience, again, it really opened my eyes to an entirely different set of issues that I had no idea about. And then the government shutdown happened in 2013. And for about 2 weeks, myself and all the other federal employees at the Smithsonian who were deemed non-essential were told to stay at home, don't check your email, you can't come into the office. And I thought, you know what, maybe it's time for me to leave the federal government. And I decided to start looking around for a job that wouldn't be subject to the whims of a rather dysfunctional Congress at the time. And that search is what led me to the nonprofit humanitarian field. So I'll be honest, before I started working in this area, I had no idea what the United Nations really did. Unlike many of my colleagues at the UN Foundation, I didn't do Model UN as a student, although some of my colleagues had ulterior motives for doing Model UN. One coworker was telling me he actually joined Model UN in the 8th grade so he could be near a woman he had a crush on. And that relationship didn't work out, but it sparked a lifelong love of the UN, but that's a whole nother story. For me, though, when I thought about the UN, if I thought about the UN, I pictured colorful flags waving in front of the headquarters in New York and world leaders shaking hands. That was really the extent of my knowledge. And I've learned a lot since then, and I still have a lot to learn. But in the past 4 years, I've had the opportunity to meet the men and women who carry out the UN's mission every day. And I'm not just talking about UN staffers. I'm talking about local NGOs, entrepreneurs, community leaders who are partnering with the UN every day to make their work possible. I've traveled, as Casey mentioned, to Tanzania, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and these experiences really transform how I look at almost everything, from power and politics to farming and food. Because I think it's really too easy to think of the UN as this big, massive, impersonal institution, right? It's big numbers and abstract ideas. And so part of our challenge at the UN Foundation is really putting a human face on this work. Because the courage and the dedication of UN staffers and partners is too often overlooked. And the voices of the people who are working with the UN are too often unheard. So today what I'd like to do is introduce you to some of the incredible people behind the statistics of the UN and the stories of its impact and how all of you here in this room can play a part. So first I want to start with a pop quiz. Who is older, the United Nations or Donald Trump? Any guesses? The UN. You got it. Believe it or not, the UN is just 1 year older than Donald Trump. For the past 73 years, the UN and its partners have tackled major global problems, and we don't talk about the successes enough. Their partners and the UN have fixed the hole in the ozone layer, they've cut poverty rates in half, they've eradicated diseases like smallpox. But today, why does the UN matter? And what does oh, I need my battery. It's in my blue bag, thank you. So what does its impact look like today? We're talking about the past 73 years and all the success that has happened. And I could start here. The big numbers, the impressive stats that illustrate the enormous scale of the UN's humanitarian operations. The UN World Food Program, for example, is the largest provider of school meals in the world. But I'd actually rather have you hear it firsthand from a student that I met 3 years ago in Bangladesh, who relies on these school meals from the UN World Food Program. And her name is Shriti. So as we mentioned, we had some issues with sound. Luckily, this is captioned, but you're not going to be able to hear Shriti's voice, which is one of my favorite parts about the video. But here we go. So that was Shriti. And let me just get back on track here. For those of you who couldn't maybe read the caption, because I know this is kind of small, Shriti lives in Bashnatek, one of the oldest slums in Dhaka. And as she talked about in this video, she's able to go to school instead of working in a garment factory like her older sister because she receives a nutritious meal in the classroom from the UN. She receives what are called high-energy biscuits, which are basically fortified with all of the nutrients and the calories that someone would need for an entire day. And I think what's really amazing about that video is, I don't know if you guys caught, but at one point she says in English, "I'm not sad." Did you guys hear that? I love that line because I think too often we picture the people that the UN are serving and don't think about the empowering ways that the UN is helping them. And what Shriti is telling us is, because of this high-energy biscuit that I get in the classroom, I'm able to study, I'm going to become a teacher, and I'm going to support my mom, who was paralyzed with a stroke when she was really young. And it's the promise of that school meal that enables her to attend school so that she doesn't have to work and help put food on the table. So last year alone, the UN provided school meals to more than 18 million children like Shriti in 60 countries all over the world. And as you guys, I think, all know, access to education is crucial to breaking the cycle of poverty and hunger that exists. And the cool thing about the UN School Meals Program is that it's not just providing nutrition to students like Shriti either. It's also helping smallholder farmers like this man. His name's Yoon. I met Yoon in rural Cambodia last summer, and he participates in what the UN calls its Homegrown School Meals Program. So the way this works, it's pretty simple, but instead of shipping in grain from other countries like the US, the UN is now working with smallholder farmers wherever possible to use locally grown crops to source its school meals. So Yoon told me how proud he is that he is harvesting fresh vegetables like spinach and cucumbers that his daughter here is able to eat along with her classmates at school. And this means that Yoon now has a reliable buyer for his crops who will pay him a fair price. The UN is saving money on shipping and storage costs because they're not having to bring this grain from across the country or the world in some cases. And children like his daughter can now have fresher and even more nutritious meals than the traditional porridge that the UN provides and has provided for the past 50 years. So this homegrown approach to school meals, it's smart, it's sustainable, and it's just one example of how the UN is evolving and continues to evolve. The UN also supports mothers, about 1 million mothers every single month, during what the doctors call the golden window. Have you guys ever heard of this term? So the golden window is the time between a mother's pregnancy and a child's second birthday when getting adequate nutrition is paramount. In fact, it really shapes a child's destiny, the nutrition they get in that window. Babies who are malnourished during this time, they suffer from irreversible mental and physical stunting. When you are in the womb and until your second birthday, if you don't get the nutrients and the calories you need, your body will literally shrink itself to survive. And you can't get that time back. So what the UN does is they work with community centers, health clinics, to provide fortified foods, vaccinations, education about nutrition, information on breastfeeding and sanitation, all to make sure that the most vulnerable children in the world have a healthy start to life, aren't immediately born with a disadvantage. And in 2014, I traveled to Tanzania and I got to see this work firsthand. So this photo is from a health clinic in rural Singida. And this child is being measured for malnutrition using a really simple and very smart method, especially when you consider that a lot of these areas where they're working don't have access to electricity or expensive equipment. This band right here, it's called MUAC. It stands for mid-upper arm circumference. And it allows aid workers to determine which children are malnourished and require fortified foods so that they can stay on track. Now this kind of work, I want to go back to a point I made earlier, which is this kind of work is not possible without all of the local community partners who work with the UN. And this is one of them. This is a woman named Havisa. And she's a village health worker in Singida who told me that she walks about 2 to 3 hours every day on foot to visit new mothers in their homes and check on these babies and see how they're doing. And she actually serves as a key connector between the UN and the communities. And she was nominated for this role by her neighbors, who found her to be trustworthy. They knew that she would do a great job. And she told me she's so proud to be able to do this work, especially because she's a mother herself. And she knows how scary it can be to be a new mom, especially if your child is sick. Another crucial aspect to the UN's work. As conflict is raging in South Sudan and Syria and Yemen, you guys have probably heard this by now, but there are more displaced people worldwide than any other time in human history, even during World War II. And that's why this is a huge, huge component of the UN's work. And this means assisting, what does assisting displaced people mean? Well, it means providing all of the basic needs so that families that have been forced to leave everything behind can survive. So that's shelter, food, medicine, access to education. But again, I think it's so much easier and more impactful to show this story through someone like this young man. This is Gat. His full name is Gatluak Ramdiat, but he goes by Gat for short. And for nearly half of his childhood, Gat and his brother lived in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. They walked on foot, just the two of them, for about a week when they were fleeing violence in Darfur, when the violence reached their village. Their parents had left a couple days earlier in search of food and never returned. He was 9 years old when he fled to this refugee camp, and I talked to him in August, and I was asking about why the UN matters. And his answer to me was really simple. If the UN didn't exist, I wouldn't be here today. He spent 6 years in that refugee camp, and he told me the first time that he ever attended school was because of the textbooks and materials and pencils that UNICEF provided in this refugee camp. And he told me that he and his brother wouldn't have survived if they didn't have food from the UN World Food Program. All of the people on the ground at these refugee camps are true heroes, he said. I know this firsthand from my own experience. The work of the UN is the only stability that many refugees know. And Gat is a really incredible success story because when he was 15 years old, he moved to Nebraska as part of the Lost Boys of Sudan initiative. And today, he's a third-year law student at the University of Nebraska, and he fulfilled a childhood dream this summer by interning at the UN headquarters in New York. So just imagine that journey that he took from living in a refugee camp as a 9-year-old to as a 27-year-old interning at the UN and getting to witness the UN Security Council pass resolutions to help humanitarian workers deliver aid in South Sudan, in what is now his country. So the UN is filled with stories like this, of these unsung heroes that we just don't hear about, who are answering the call to service, not just for their own countries, but for the world. Peacekeepers who put their lives on the line to stabilize communities. Community workers who travel in the most remote areas of the world to vaccinate children from deadly diseases. Scientists who analyze the health of our planet and give us crucial information to act on. It's courageous people like this woman, Shireen Akhtar. She works for UNHCR and is assisting Rohingya families in Bangladesh in what has become, in less than a year, the largest refugee camp in the world. It's now home to 1 million people. It's people like this woman, Anjali Sen. She works for the UN Population Fund, and she helps women and girls in Yemen, which is now home to the world's largest humanitarian crisis. And it's people like this woman, Afra. She's a Syrian aid worker who has a really interesting perspective because she not only serves displaced Syrians in her country, she's displaced herself. Her home was bombed. And I interviewed Afra in 2016, and she told me this incredible story. She was on a humanitarian convoy in 2014 in northeast Syria, which is an ISIS stronghold. And she and her aid workers were kidnapped and held for ransom. And she told me that the local Syrians actually helped negotiate her release. So there was an incredible role reversal that happened, where she was rescued by the very same community that she was there to serve for the UN World Food Program. But the UN's work, again, is not just about the people that are serving on the front lines, like Afra and Shirin. It's also about individuals like this man. This is Dr. Abebe Haragowan. He lives in Washington, D.C. And I had a chance to meet Abebe a couple years ago. He has a really amazing story. So he's an Ethiopian immigrant. And before he came to the US, he actually witnessed and lived through Ethiopia's famine in the 1980s. So when a historic drought hit Ethiopia in 2015, Abebe decided to launch a fundraiser in his community through Facebook. And he raised $30,000 in a matter of weeks to support the UN's relief efforts. Because having lived through one of the most awful times in his country's history, he knew how important it was for everybody to step up and do their part. And as Abebe showed, tackling global challenges like poverty and hunger and climate change, they require all hands on deck. Because I don't mean to alarm you, but we need a bigger boat. And what does that mean? What does all hands on deck mean? Well, it means major global companies like MasterCard stepping up to help the UN. What you're looking at right now is sort of the food assistance 2.0. Thanks to MasterCard's support, refugees in places like Lebanon and Jordan can now purchase fresh, locally grown food from local supermarkets instead of standing in line and receiving traditional food rations. And there are so many benefits to this approach. They're supporting local economies. They're able to purchase food that traditional food rations would not include, like meat and dairy and fruit. So these electronic food vouchers that really work like e-cards, they were introduced about 5 years ago. They've injected more than $1 billion into Lebanon's economy alone. So the UN is saving money. Refugees are having more access and more freedom and more dignity to choose the meals that they cook. And local shopkeepers are getting support from these refugees in their communities. And this is one more example, right, of how the UN is evolving and becoming more sustainable. All hands on deck looks like innovators, like this woman. This is Alexandria Lofsky. Alexandria is a Teach for America alumni, and she served in Washington, D.C. And this experience opened her eyes to the reality of child homelessness and how housing instability affects students. So she decided at the age of 24 to found New Story, a nonprofit that is transforming slums into sustainable housing by harnessing the power of 3D technology. Here's an example. In 24 hours, New Story can print, if you will, a new 600 square foot home for less than $4,000. And so far, they've constructed homes in Haiti, Mexico, and Bolivia. And by next summer, their organization hopes to build an entire community of 100 homes in El Salvador. And I had a chance to meet Alexandria just last month. She attended the UN General Assembly and met with UN officials and country officials to spread the word about what she was doing as a way to help tackle a crisis that is widespread in poor communities. Okay, so I'm talking about all hands on deck, but what does that mean? What are we working toward? Does anybody recognize? All right, I see some nodding heads. So for those of you who don't know, just 3 years ago, the UN unanimously ratified a global game plan outlining 17 ambitious goals, from eradicating poverty to encouraging partnerships. If you just take a step back and think about that all 193 UN member states on this planet unanimously agreed to anything, it's pretty amazing, let alone 17 very, very ambitious goals. But these are more than just utopian ideals. Behind each of these goals are very measurable benchmarks that all countries have agreed to work toward. They're called the SDGs for short, again with the UN and its acronyms. This global game plan also came with a deadline, the year 2030. So if we make it, if we achieve these global goals that all 193 UN member states have agreed to, it's going to be because of the young people in this room. You're going to take us over the finish line. All right, so 3 years into this game plan, how do you guys think we're doing? Any guesses? Mixed. That's exactly right. I won't mince words. It's not going great. and the conflicts that are happening and climate change are two of the big reasons why. In fact, just last month, Brookings Institution released a report giving us a little bit of a progress update on where we're at with the SDGs. Now, the good news is we're making progress. It's happening. The bad news is it's not happening fast enough. We're not accelerating progress on the level that we need to make this 2030 deadline. And actually, what was interesting is this report found that the majority of people who are at risk of being left behind in our pursuit of these 17 global goals live in just a handful of countries. Nigeria, for example, is projected to be home to 1/4 of the world's extreme poverty by 2030, if trends continue. But it's not just developing nations that are struggling either and need to accelerate progress. The US also needs to step up in a big way. The Brookings report found that if business continues as usual, the US will rank in the top 5 for child obesity, lack of access to family planning, and a lack of opportunity for women in public leadership. The Brookings report also found that women and girls stand to lose the most if we miss the mark. In fact, an estimated 850 million women across the world will suffer physical and sexual violence in 2030 without a major breakthrough. And the consequences for not meeting these goals are enormous. Raise your hand if you saw the latest UN report on climate change. Pretty grim. Guys saw it. According to the world's top scientists, humanity has little more than a decade to bend the curve of fossil fuel emissions or risk a catastrophic environmental breakdown. So it's urgent. We all need to step up. And that's why we need to be living out these sustainable development goals in our own lives. And I love this UN. The UN actually put out the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. And it has 4 different levels. And you can start with level 1. And level 1 is turning off the lights when you leave a room. All the way up to level 4, which is joining a UN association chapter and lobbying your lawmakers. So there are everyday actions that each and every one of us can take. I know that my friend Casey took public transportation to be here at the University YMCA. Nice, good work. Reducing food waste in your household. It means voting with your wallets and purchasing from companies that you know to be socially and environmentally responsible. It means students standing up here on campus at U of I and working to get U of I to divest from coal. All of these actions, when taken together, really add up. All hands on deck, and you guys will appreciate this, I think most recently, looks like local leaders stepping up when national leaders don't. So when Trump decided to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement this year, state governors and mayors across the country proclaimed they were still in, and they formed the US Climate Alliance. And just last month at the first ever Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, this alliance announced plans to channel $1.4 billion into driving down auto emissions and reducing the pollutants that are accelerating climate change. Meanwhile, 4 US states, Connecticut, Hawaii, New York, and Minnesota, joined the cities of Rotterdam, Honolulu, and LA as the newest members of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And their chief aim? To phase out traditional coal-fired power plants, which produce right now 40% of global electricity, making carbon pollution from coal a leading cause and contributor to climate change. And this is the good news, right? That local and state and government leaders are stepping up to keep the US in this game. And this kind of action is happening right here on campus. Last night, I had the opportunity to meet U of I students who are doing something really incredible. They just, for the first time in the school's history, launched the first ever chapter on campus of the United Nations Association of the United States of America. Kind of wordy. I'm going to give you another acronym, UNA-USA. And this grassroots movement is actually as old as the UN itself. And in fact, the reason why I have former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt up here is because she spent the last remaining years of her public service traveling across the country and singing the praises of UNA-USA and personally launching chapters across the US. And what I love about UNA-USA is it's a way for people across the country to join forces and collectively use their actions to protect the progress that the UN has made over the past 73 years and to make sure that this progress continues. So probably a lot of you have heard of Model UN, an educational simulation that allows students to step into the roles of ambassadors to solve problems. These UNA-USA campus chapters are really the next step so that college students who are already engaged with the UN can take the issues that are happening in their communities and apply the UN values and make sure that their local leaders know that they can play a role. And this year alone, UNA-USA has seen a 25% increase in the number of chapters on college campuses. And the new U of I chapter that was just started this semester is part of that grassroots movement. And this comes at a pivotal time because more and more US leaders are questioning supporting the UN. So in June, what you're looking at here are 500 delegates from UNA-USA chapters all across the country who descended on Capitol Hill to tell every single lawmaker, to knock on every single lawmaker's door and tell them that US leadership and partner with the UN is important and that it remains as important as it first was in the aftermath of World War II. And tomorrow, this new UNA-USA chapter here on campus is hosting a 5K at the Arboretum to benefit UNICEF. So I would invite you guys to check it out and participate because that is what living out the Sustainable Development Goals in your daily life looks like. Because if there's one thing that I have learned interviewing UN staffers and talking with the families that the UN serves, it's that everyone, everywhere, has a role to play and that every single dollar counts. You know, I mentioned that some US leaders are questioning whether or not we should be playing an active leadership role in the UN. And I think it's worth remembering that the opportunity to transform lives and to make the world a better place comes at a very tiny percentage of the overall US budget. Any guesses what percentage of our budget goes to the UN dues and humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping? 0.2%. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. So when you hear people talking about the US is providing the most money to support the UN, put that into context. 0.2% to make sure that refugees like Gat are able to eat, that students in need like Shriti are able to stay in the classroom. This is a really exciting time, I think, to be working for the UN Foundation, and also a little scary, as you can imagine, living in DC. And in many ways, I think we're, as a country, facing a pivotal moment where we want to decide, what do we stand for? What kind of legacy do we want to leave our children? And I think we're all kind of facing a pretty fundamental question, which is, will global challenges like climate change bring the world together or tear us apart? In 2016, the journalist Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times, "In your lifetime, we have a decent chance of virtually wiping out ills that have plagued humanity for thousands of generations, from illiteracy to the most devastating kind of hand-to-mouth poverty. Just think about how incredible that is. You know, at a time when we're bombarded with really discouraging news, I think it's worth taking a step back and looking at the big picture, and again, remembering all of the incredible progress that we've made in the past 73 years. But we can only get there together. And that's why I wanted to share the stories of these incredible individuals across the country and the world who are supporting the UN in all sorts of different and amazing ways. And I've had the opportunity to meet with some of the U of I students here, and I mean, I love your passion and your intelligence and your commitment. You know, before I came here, I joked with my boss that I was going to feed off of the youth and energy of the students, and I really have, because you guys give me hope that we're going to continue this fight. Especially coming from DC, I need all the hope I can get, right? I want to end by, first of all, thanking you guys for giving me your lunch hour, and to thank Casey and the University YMCA, because you guys have shaped me more than you will ever realize. And I want to leave you with what I hope is a simple request. If you hear anybody in your communities or your family questioning the UN or its impact, I would ask you to please consider sharing the stories of individuals like Shriti and Gat and Afra and Abebe, the very real people behind the work who make this progress possible. As some of you know, Kofi Annan passed away in August. He's a former UN Secretary General and actually a founding board member of the UN Foundation. And I want to close with a quote that feels really apt right now. Kofi once said, "More than ever before in human history, we share a common destiny. The only answer to this divided world must be a truly united nations." Thank you. Okay, so let's open it up for some questions.
So, I just heard an interview with a woman who's with the UN Refugee Association. She's down in Mexico signing people from the caravan. Such a hot button issue right now. Little sense behind it. Signing them up for refugee status in Mexico. So, all that goes quite unsung, quite unnoticed. And just, most of us think about what's going on in the Security Council, right? The big dynamics. But I don't think we really know what happens there either. And I want to pick on Yemen because that's another egregious situation right now. The time in the first Gulf War under Herbert Walker Bush, Yemen voted against authorizing the attack. And the ambassador went up to him, loudly proclaiming that was the most expensive veto we've ever voted, and cut off all aid to Yemen. I don't think it was restored ever. So the poorest Arab country in the world, and the UN is trying to do what they can, but they've had to withdraw because of the circumstance, fueled by U.S. weapons and even more. They have mercenaries there. But so I'm sorry, it's a bit of a rant. Maybe somebody will stay on more on topic here. But there are two places where the UN is trying to do something unsung and really in battle situation.
I completely agree with you, and I think the news about the caravan is an example of why we need people sharing facts and debunking myths. I think, you know, people often conflate migrants and refugees, and they're very distinct, and it's an important legal definition. So people who are fleeing persecution and violence have this refugee status. People who are pursuing economic opportunity are migrants. And I think what the caravan really shows is the importance of understanding that distinction and not villainizing people who are trying to just find safety and asylum for their families. So actually yesterday, Gat published an op-ed in his local Omaha World Herald newspaper to kind of share his story with the people of Nebraska and to point out that refugees and immigrants are not terrorists. They are contributing to society in really important ways. And to also thank the people of Nebraska for welcoming him. He's lived there now for 12 years. And he told me, I'm a South Sudanese American, and I'm here to make America great.
I'm delighted to hear that there's a student chapter of the United States Association being formed. There's been a Champaign County Union USA since 1957, when my wife and I first came here.
Amazing.
This is a very kind of YMCA here is very supportive of it.
Glad you mentioned that.
Your old dog sitting right up there in the front row, and we have an international program that he is involved with, and if this chapter leadership might be interested in affiliating with the YMCA, I saw Casey over here.
You read my mind. You totally read my mind. I completely agree with you. And in fact, after I addressed the UNA chapter last night, they took me out to Murphy's because I was craving a burger and fries. And I invited Casey to come along because I was kind of surprised to learn that some of the UNA folks weren't too familiar with the University YMCA, but I feel like they would benefit. So get on that, Casey.
Well, I think the two groups can support one another. I mean, there's staff support and other resources that like
And I think the community chapter too. I mean, I'm going to share that with the head of the campus chapter because I feel like the county chapter and the campus chapter should also join forces. And I think again, if there's one key takeaway from the talk, it's working together. That everybody needs to work together.
Yeah, the community chapter is struggling a little bit. Jerry Crichton was a major person involved, died recently, and Lois, I think, was in a nursing home. And so they're struggling a bit, so they're not strong, but it would help to be in touch with them.
Let's talk afterward. I'd love to get, if you have the contact information, I would love to talk to you about that. Awesome. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. Happy Friday.